There is a building I want to tell you about. It does not look like a building. If you rode past it on a winter morning, and I rode past it many times before I understood what I was looking at, you would see a low hill on the south face of a long ridge, maybe 40 feet across, grass-covered in summer and snow-covered in winter, indistinguishable from the thousands of other low hills that make up the landscape of Judith Basin in the territory of Montana. You might notice that the south face of the hill was not quite right, that the curve of it was too regular, that there were 3 small windows set into the earth at an angle that no natural formation would produce. You might slow your horse and look a second time, but you would probably ride on. I am 63 years old. I have built things in this territory for the better part of 4 decades. Houses, barns, granaries, a church that is still standing in Fergus County with its cedar shingles as tight as the day I fitted them. I have used good timber and poor timber. I have built structures that lasted and structures that did not. And I have learned over a long career to know the difference, while I am still building them rather than after. I want to tell you about the building that mattered most. Not the most beautiful, not the most technically accomplished by the measures I would have used as a young man. The one that mattered most, which is a different measure entirely, and the one I find myself returning to now that I am old enough to understand the difference. There is a newspaper in Helena that published an account last autumn of the winter of 1886 to 1887. The winter the territory calls the Great Die-Up, though no one called it anything that winter except the cold, and God help us. The account was thorough in some ways. It described the scale of the cattle losses, the failure of the open-range system, the ranchers who were ruined in a single season. It was the kind of history that records what happened to industries and economies and territories. It did not mention Astrid Lindqvist. I am setting that right. I am setting it right now in the spring of 1921 because I am one of the last people alive who was present for what I am about to describe, and because history that leaves out the most important parts is not history. It is a comfortable story told by people who were not there. My daughter Clara is writing this down as I speak. She has her mother's handwriting, clear and unhurried, and she has agreed to write exactly what I say without improving it, which is the only condition I set. I do not need improvement. I need accuracy. These are not always the same thing, and at 63 I have stopped pretending otherwise. To understand what Astrid Lindqvist built, you need to understand what Judith Basin was in the early 1880s and what winter meant in a place like that. The basin sits in the center of Montana Territory, ringed by mountains that send their cold down into the valley floor every October with a patience and a thoroughness that no amount of preparation ever entirely defeats. The grass was good, deep-rooted, and nourishing. The kind of grass that built the open-range cattle industry that had been drawing investors and ranchers from the eastern states since the mid-70s. The water was good. The summers were short but generous. Men who arrived with a modest stake and a willingness to work hard could, in favorable years, build a cattle operation that would have seemed impossible back in Ohio or Wisconsin or wherever they had come from. Winter was the accounting. From November through April, the ground froze to a depth that a shovel could not penetrate without iron bars and considerable patience. The temperature dropped below 0 in November and did not reliably return above it until March. Blizzards arrived without adequate warning and stayed without apology. The cattle that represented a rancher's entire capital, his savings, his credit, his children's inheritance, stood in barns built from whatever lumber could be hauled to the site before the season closed, board-sided structures through which the wind came as freely as it came across the open prairie, because board siding and wind were not a fair contest and the wind always knew it. Men lost animals every winter. It was expected. You built the best barn you could afford, you put up as much hay as you could cut, and you accepted that the margin between a good winter and a ruinous one was largely beyond your control. This was the orthodoxy of the basin, held with the conviction that people hold beliefs which have never been seriously tested. The men who held this orthodoxy had been in the basin for 10 and 15 and 20 years. They knew the land with the confidence of long acquaintance. They were not foolish men, most of them, and they were not unkind. They were men who had learned what worked and stopped asking whether something else might work better, which is a reasonable approach to life, until the winter that makes it fatal. I want to be fair to them. I have spent 35 years being fair to them because understanding why people believe what they believe is more useful than condemning them for it, and because some of them were my friends and most of them were decent in the ways that frontier life asks decency of people, which are specific and practical ways that do not always include imagination. But I want to be accurate too. And accuracy requires me to say that when Astrid Lindqvist arrived in Judith Basin in the spring of 1884, not one man in the valley thought she had anything to teach them. Not one. She came alone. This was the first unusual thing, and in a place that measured people quickly and by visible signs, it was noted immediately and not forgotten. A woman alone on a homestead claim, with 2 children, a girl of 6 named Britta, and a boy of 4 named Petter, and a wagon that contained everything she owned in the world, which was not very much. Her husband Eric had filed the claim through a land agent the previous year, intending to emigrate from Dalarna province in Sweden with his family the following spring. He died that winter. A fever, sudden and complete, the kind that takes a healthy man in a week and leaves no room for argument. He was 30 years old. He had never seen Montana. Astrid was 32 when she buried him. She had 2 months to decide what to do with the land claim he had filed in a country she had never been to, for land she had never seen, in a territory she knew only from the letters Eric had read aloud, from the emigration pamphlets he collected the way other men collected debts. She could have let the claim lapse. She could have stayed in Dalarna, where she had family, where she knew the language, where the winters were hard but familiar. She could have done the sensible thing, which was to grieve and regroup and make a smaller life in a known place. She packed the wagon instead. I have thought about this decision many times over the years, and I have come to believe it was not recklessness and not desperation, and not the kind of romantic notion about the frontier that the emigration pamphlets were designed to produce. I believe it was a calculation, the kind that a practical woman makes when she looks at her circumstances honestly. 2 children, modest savings, a country that would offer her limited options as a widow without property, and on the other side of the ocean, a piece of land with her husband's name on the claim and nobody else's. Land was the one thing the frontier offered that nowhere else would. She understood that. She came. The basin received her the way it received most things it did not recognize, with watchful neutrality that leaned, in her case, toward the cooler end of the spectrum. She was Swedish, which was foreign. She spoke English with an accent that marked her immediately. She was a woman managing a homestead claim without a husband, which was unusual enough to be remarked upon. She was, by the measure of the valley, an unknown quantity in a place that preferred known quantities. None of this is remarkable as a description of how frontiers treat newcomers. What was somewhat more particular to Astrid's situation was the quality of the attention she received, not hostile, rarely openly rude, but consistently positioned at the margin of things. Her name was not on the petition that went to the county office about the water rights allocation on the Eastern Creek tributary, though her land was directly affected. When the valley held its spring barn raising for the Halverson place, the notification reached every homestead in the basin except hers, an oversight that was explained when she asked about it with an apology so smooth it was clearly practiced. She noted these things. She did not mention them, as far as I ever knew, to anyone. She simply noted them and filed them in whatever place a person files the accurate knowledge of where they actually stand, as opposed to where they are told they stand. She had, in any case, more pressing concerns than the social geography of the basin. The first concern was the winter. She had arrived in May, which gave her one growing season before the cold came. She planted a kitchen garden and put up hay on the small meadow below the ridge. She introduced herself to her nearest neighbors, Riley to the north, Halverson to the west, and received the information that newcomers always receive, which is useful in parts and wrong in other parts, and which she had no way yet of sorting between. She got through that first winter by the margin that competent and careful people sometimes get through things, not comfortably, but without catastrophe. She lost no cattle. She ran low on firewood in January during a cold snap that lasted 11 days and dropped the temperature to 35 below. And she was 2 days from a situation that would have required her to burn furniture when a cord of split pine appeared stacked against the east wall of her cabin one morning without explanation or note. She did not know who had left it for 3 years. When she found out, when Halverson mentioned it obliquely during the construction of Riley's barn, in the context of a conversation about something else entirely, she said nothing. She simply looked at him for a moment with her gray eyes, and then looked back at the timber she was helping to fit, and Halverson looked at the timber too, and that was the end of it. But before that winter was out, before the firewood situation had resolved itself one way or another, she had made a decision. She went through Eric's trunk. She had not opened it since she packed it in Sweden. It contained the things a man keeps that are not quite practical enough to be tools and not quite sentimental enough to be keepsakes. An old pipe, a folding knife with a cracked handle, 3 letters in Swedish from his mother, and at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept it dry through an ocean crossing, and a wagon journey and one Montana winter, a small leather notebook. The notebook had belonged to her grandfather, Niels Eriksson. Eric had asked for it as a wedding gift. He had always liked Niels, and Niels had pressed it into his hands at the wedding with the comment that a man going to a cold country ought to have it. Niels was dead by the time Astrid opened the trunk. She had not been there for his death. She had been on a ship crossing the Atlantic. She unwrapped the oilcloth in the lamplight, opened the notebook, and read her grandfather's handwriting for the first time. What she found there was not a letter, and not a memoir, and not the kind of personal document that a person keeps for sentimental reasons. It was a technical record, the observations and calculations and hard-learned lessons of a man who had spent 20 winters maintaining a particular kind of underground livestock barn on a south-facing hillside in Dalarna province, and who had written down everything he knew about it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that knowledge unrecorded is knowledge that dies with the person who holds it. She read it through once that night, and then again, and then a third time with a piece of paper beside her on which she was making her own notes. Outside, the temperature was 30 below and falling. Inside the notebook, in her grandfather's careful hand, there were drawings. I never met Niels Eriksson. He died in Dalarna in the winter of 1883, in the farmhouse where he had been born and from which he had never traveled more than 40 miles in any direction. He was 71 years old. He had built his first Jordstall at the age of 36 in the summer before the catastrophic freeze of 1848, working from a description his own grandfather had given him of a technique older than anyone in the valley could trace with certainty, something the Norse settlers of hard climates had been doing for so long that the reason for it had stopped being explained and had simply become practice, the way the deepest knowledge always does, passed hand to hand until the hands forget they are passing anything and simply do. He kept records because he was, by nature and by trade, a man who kept records. He was a farmer and a part-time surveyor, and surveyors understand that the distance between what you remember and what you measured is exactly the distance between useful knowledge and comfortable story. He wrote down what worked and what failed and why he believed it failed, and he wrote down the changes he made the following season, and he wrote down the results of those changes with the same level-headed honesty that a good doctor brings to a case that is not going the way he expected. He wrote in Swedish, in a hand that Astrid later described to me as small and very regular, the handwriting of a man who had been taught penmanship seriously and had never lost the habit of it. He had filled the notebook over 20 years of winters. Some pages were crowded with calculations. Others had only a sentence or two, an observation he wanted to preserve, a warning to whoever came after, a note in the margin that was clearly addressed to no one in particular and to anyone who would listen. It was one of those marginal notes that Astrid read to me years later, after she had taught me enough Swedish to follow the sound of it while she gave me the meaning in English. I will come back to that note at the end of this account because it is the right place for it. For now I want to tell you what the notebook contained and what Astrid made of it and what she did next. The central principle of Niels Jordstall was one that any farmer who had ever dug a root cellar had encountered without necessarily understanding. The earth, at sufficient depth, maintains a temperature that the seasons cannot meaningfully alter. At the surface, the ground obeys the air above it. It freezes in November and thaws in April and bakes in July and cools again in September, following the sky's instructions like a dutiful student. But go down 5 feet, and the earth begins to have opinions of its own. Go down 8 or 10 feet, and the sky's instructions have become irrelevant. At that depth, the ground holds a temperature established over centuries of thermal equilibrium. In Dalarna, Niels had measured it at approximately 38 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of what the air above was doing. 38 degrees is cold. It will not grow tomatoes. It will not warm a man who has come in from the frost. But it will not freeze a water pipe, and it will not kill a healthy cow. And if you build a structure that encloses a volume of air at that depth and gives that air a way to collect the additional warmth that 12 or 14 cattle produce simply by being alive, which is, Niels had calculated, roughly equivalent to a small stove burning continuously, you will find that your underground barn maintains a temperature somewhere between 40 and 48 degrees, depending on the animal load and the quality of your roof insulation, even when the air above is 40 degrees below zero. The difference between 48 degrees inside and 40 below outside is 88 degrees of thermal separation achieved entirely without fuel. No coal, no wood, no iron stove to feed and tend and fear, just the earth and the animals, and the understanding of how they could be made to work together. Niels had written the principle down plainly, in language a farmer rather than a scientist would use, but with the precision of a man who had tested the idea against 20 winters and trusted his measurements more than his hopes. He had written the dimensions of his original Jordstall, 30 feet long, 14 wide, 7 feet of clearance at the north wall, and the reasoning behind each dimension. He had written about the south-facing slope and why it mattered, not just for the wind protection of the ridge above, but for the winter sun, which hangs low on the southern horizon in the high latitudes and requires a steep roof angle to be captured at all. He had written about drainage and ventilation and thermal mass, and the particular problem of moisture accumulation in an enclosed underground space containing warm-breathing animals, which was not a small problem and required a specific solution that he had arrived at through 2 winters of trial and 1 winter of error, that he described with a directness that I have always respected in men who write about their failures as clearly as their successes. Astrid read all of this in the lamplight of a Montana January, with the temperature outside at 30 below and her 2 children asleep in the back room, and she took notes. She was not an engineer. She had not been educated beyond what the village school in Dalarna provided, which was reading and arithmetic and enough geography to understand approximately where you were in the world. But she had grown up on a farm, and farming at the level her family practiced, it was an education in physics and hydrology and structural mechanics that no classroom would have organized in the same way. The knowledge was practical, embedded in specific problems with specific consequences, and she had absorbed it the way children absorb what they see done well repeatedly over many years. She could read Niels' notebook the way it was meant to be read, which was as a working document rather than a text. She could look at his drainage calculation and understand why he had angled the floor the way he had, and she could look at his ventilation pipe placement and see the logic of convection that he was exploiting, warm air rising and drawing the stale air out, no mechanical assistance required. She could look at his window angle, 52 degrees in Dalarna, and understand that Montana's latitude was different, that the sun would hang lower here in December than it had in Sweden, and that the angle would need to be steeper, and she could estimate from the geometry of the problem approximately how much steeper. She filled 4 pages of her own paper that night. Then she put the notebook back in the oilcloth, wrapped it carefully, and set it on the shelf above the stove where she kept the things she needed to be able to find. She did not tell anyone what she was thinking, not yet. She had learned, in the months since arriving in the basin, that announcing intentions before you had anything to show for them was an invitation to the kind of help that is indistinguishable from interference. She would think first, plan first. Then, when the ground thawed and she could begin to test the theory against the actual hillside she had been looking at all winter through the south window of her cabin, she would see what the land had to say about it. I came into the story in late July of 1885, which was a full season after Astrid had made her decision and 6 weeks after she had begun to act on it. I was 26 years old, working a carpentry contract for a rancher named Gunderson 8 miles to the east. I had been in the basin since the previous autumn, and I knew it the way a young man doing contract work comes to know a place: the roads, the distances, the names of the significant people, and the quality of the lumber available at the Lewistown Mercantile, which was adequate but not generous. I had heard about the Lindqvist widow, the way you heard about most things in a basin of that size, which was at the general store or the post exchange in the form of remarks offered without particular malice, but without particular accuracy either. She was digging something behind her barn. She had been at it since May. Thomas Riley, whose north pasture abutted her eastern fence line, said he had ridden past twice and could not determine whether she was digging a root cellar or had lost her reason. He said this without cruelty. Riley was not a cruel man, but with the specific confidence of a person who has decided what category a thing belongs to before examining it. I rode out to her place on a Tuesday, which was my day without a specific obligation, because I was a young carpenter who had heard that someone was building something unusual, and unusual buildings were the ones I had not yet solved, which made them the most interesting kind. What I found was this. She had opened a cut in the south face of the long ridge behind her cabin, 200 yards up the slope from the small barn where she kept her cattle. The cut went straight into the hill at a depth that surprised me. I had expected a root cellar, which typically goes down 4 or 5 feet and stops. This went down 8 feet at the back wall and perhaps 4 feet at the front, so the floor sloped inward as you moved into the hill, and the back wall stood a full 8 feet of height in the earth. The dimensions laid out on the surface were 40 feet long and 16 wide. She was moving a wheelbarrow of earth up a ramp she had constructed from scrap lumber when I arrived. She did not stop when she heard my horse. She finished the load, tipped it onto the pile she was building along the north and east sides of the excavation. I understood immediately that she was using the excavated earth as a berm for additional wind protection, which was correct. And then she set down the wheelbarrow and looked at me without expression. I had been told she was a foreign widow who was doing something peculiar. What I saw was a woman who had been doing heavy labor for 6 weeks in the Montana summer and who was not finished and knew it and had made her peace with that fact. Her hands were in a condition that I recognized from my own at the end of long projects. Her bearing was the bearing of someone who has a great deal of work left and has decided to be accurate about it rather than discouraged. I told her my name and my trade. I told her I was curious about what she was building. She considered me for a moment, the measuring kind of consideration that experienced people use on strangers, not unfriendly, but not ceremonial either. And then she said she had some questions about timber load-bearing that she had been working through, and if I was willing to look at her plans, she would value a carpenter's opinion. The plans were the notebook and the 4 pages of her own notes and a series of careful drawings she had made on brown paper, dimensioned in a mixture of Swedish and English measurements with conversion notations in the margins. I crouched at the edge of the excavation and looked through them while she waited. They were the plans of someone who understood what they were building. The excavation dimensions were correct for the intended structural loads. The floor slope was adequate for drainage, but not so steep as to make the space difficult to work in. She had located the south wall correctly, far enough back from the cut face to allow for the earthen berm she was building above it. The window placement she had marked at 55 degrees from horizontal, with a notation in Swedish that I asked her to translate. Winter sun at this latitude requires steeper angle than grandfather used in Sweden, calculated from December noon shadow length. May need adjustment. Will confirm when structure is complete and sun is lower. I looked up from the plans. I asked her what the structure was for. She told me about the Jordstall. She told me about Niels and the winter of 1848, and the notebook and the principle of geothermal stability, and the south-facing window angle, and the convection ventilation system, and the drainage tile she intended to run through the back wall to a dry well on the north side of the ridge. She told me all of this in the direct, translating from something more precise way she had of speaking English, standing at the edge of the excavation with her hands at her sides, not selling me on anything, simply giving me the information and waiting to see what I made of it. When she finished, I looked back at the plans and then down into the excavation. The walls were plumb, and the floor was level, and the berm was properly proportioned, and everything I could see had been done right by a person working from incomplete instructions in unfamiliar material on land she had been living on for 14 months. I told her the drainage was going to pool at the back if she did not add a secondary channel along the base of the north wall. She pulled out her pencil and wrote it down. I told her the load distribution on the roof frame was going to require a heavier primary timber than anything available at the Lewistown Mercantile, and that I knew a man near Utica who milled Douglas fir to custom dimensions and would deliver for a reasonable fee. She wrote that down, too. I asked her how much of the excavation she had left to do. She looked at the cut and looked at the berm and did a calculation in her head that I could not follow. Then she said, "About 3 weeks, if the soil on the west side held as well as the east had." I said I could come back on Saturdays until my Gunderson contract finished, and after that I could give her more time if the project warranted it. She looked at me with those gray eyes for a moment. She said she could not pay much. I said I was not asking for much. I was a carpenter, and she was describing a carpentry problem, and it would bother me, at a fundamental professional level, to know that such a problem was being solved in my vicinity without my having had a hand in it. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, or not only warmth, but a kind of recognition. The recognition of a person who has been working alone long enough to have forgotten that working alongside someone is a different thing, and sometimes a better one. She said, "Come back Saturday." I did, and I want to tell you who else was there when I arrived, because this part of the story is one that the telling has always left out, and the leaving out diminishes it. Sitting at the top of the ramp, sorting a pile of salvaged lumber by length with the efficient attention of someone who has done it before, was a boy of about 14 with the particular mixed complexion of the Métis people who move through the basin following seasonal patterns that the homestead surveys had not quite figured out how to account for. He looked up when I rode in and then went back to sorting the lumber. His name was Louis Deschamps. He spoke Michif and French and was learning English from Astrid in exchange for his labor through the summer months. She taught him an hour each evening by lamplight, reading from the 2 books she had brought from Sweden that happened to be in English, a Bible and a surveying manual that had belonged to Eric. He was, as I came to understand over the following weeks, the only person in the basin who had known from the beginning exactly what Astrid was building, because she had explained it to him fully on the first day, treating him as a partner in the project rather than a hand hired to move dirt. he was a quick study. By August, he was reading simple sentences without help. By September, he was asking questions about the ventilation system that required Astrid to go back to the notebook for the answer. When the excavation was complete and the building work began, he was there for every Saturday I came and for every day between. He learned to fit a log joint by watching me do it twice and then doing it himself. He learned to read a level and to calculate a roof pitch from its rise and run. He learned the difference between wood that would hold a load and wood that would not, which is a knowledge that lives partly in the hands and partly in the eye, and can only be acquired by handling a great deal of both kinds. In September, when the leaves were turning and the first frost was putting an end to the growing season above ground, Louis's family's camp moved north to the winter territory where the Métis bands had always gone, and Louis went with them. He shook hands with Astrid and then with me. He did not say much. He had not said much all summer, which is not the same as not having understood everything. He picked up his kit and walked north. Astrid watched him go from the top of the ridge for a while. Then she went back down to the structure that they had built together, checked the drainage channel one more time, and began planning the roof. A roof is where a building tells you the truth about itself. Walls are forgiving. You can shore a wall that leans, refit a joint that has worked loose, pack clay into a gap that has opened over winter, and trust that the repair will hold. Walls fail slowly with warnings, and a man who is paying attention can usually get ahead of a wall before it becomes a crisis. A roof fails all at once. This is not a metaphor. I am speaking as a carpenter who has been inside buildings when their roofs failed and who carries in his body a particular quality of attention that activates whenever he is assessing a structure that will be asked to bear weight from above. The weight of snow primarily in this part of the world, but also the weight of the earth itself. In the case of what we were building on Astrid's Ridge, which was not the weight of a drifted cornice or an ice load, but the full, permanent, non-negotiable weight of 2 feet of compacted soil and the sod laid over it, plus whatever snow that sod would hold before shedding it, plus the load transferred from the berm walls on 3 sides. I calculated it on paper one evening in early August and then sat with the number for a while before I showed it to Astrid. The load on the primary roof frame would be, at maximum, after a heavy snowfall before any shedding, somewhere between 900 and 1,100 pounds per linear foot of span. This is a number that eliminates most of the timber available at the Lewistown Mercantile. I sent word to the man near Utica who milled Douglas fir to custom dimensions, a Finn named Makinen, who had come to Montana by a route I never fully understood, and who ran his mill with a precision that I have always associated with people who learned their trade in places where the consequences of imprecision were severe. I rode out to his place and showed him my calculations and my required dimensions, and he looked at them for a long time without expression, which was his way of indicating that he was taking the problem seriously. He said he could have the primary beams ready in 3 weeks. He said they would be green cut, not seasoned, and I would need to account for shrinkage in my joinery. He said the price would be what the price would be, and I should tell my client to decide quickly, because he had another order coming in from a mining operation near Gilt Edge that would occupy his mill for the rest of the season. I told Astrid. She looked at the number for a moment with the expression she used when she was doing arithmetic in her head, which was a slight narrowing of the eyes and a very slight compression of her lips. Then she said, "Tell him yes." I asked her if she was certain. It was not a small amount. She said, "The roof is where this either works or it doesn't. I am not saving money on the roof. This is the kind of decision that reveals a person's understanding of a problem more clearly than anything they could say about it." She knew from the notebook, from her own reading of the principle, that the roof was the structure's critical element, not because it needed to be beautiful or because it needed to be impressive, but because it needed to carry a load that most roofs in the basin were never asked to carry, and it needed to carry that load for decades without settlement or deflection or the slow creep of green timber that eventually opens a joint that was tight when it was fitted. She was right. I have been a carpenter for 40 years, and I know when a client understands their own building and when they are guessing, and Astrid was not guessing. We got the beams. The roof system we built across that August and into September was the most complex structure I had assembled to that point in my career, and I want to describe it carefully because it is the part of the engineering that most people, when they hear about the Jordstall, do not understand and therefore do not credit correctly. The primary layer was Douglas fir beams, Mackina's work, set across the 16-foot span at 30-inch centers and notched into a wall plate of the same timber that ran the full length of the north and south walls. The notching was critical. I used a housed dovetail joint rather than a simple saddle cut, which meant the beam could not be lifted out of its seat by upward pressure from below, which is the kind of pressure that a frost-heaved wall exerts on a roof structure when you have not thought carefully about what happens at the joint during spring thaw. Above the primary beams, a secondary layer of smaller poles, lodgepole pine, peeled and dried, laid perpendicular to the beams and spaced 2 inches apart. Above the poles, split shingles overlapping like scales, tight enough to shed water, but not so tight that they could not move slightly as the poles beneath them swelled and shrank with moisture changes. Above the shingles, a continuous layer of birch bark that Astrid and I had spent 3 days harvesting from the stands of paper birch along the creek to the east, peeling it in long sheets and laying it in overlapping courses like a second roof beneath the earth. The birch bark was Niels's specification, written in the notebook in terms that made clear he had tried other waterproofing methods and found them wanting. Canvas rots. Pitch cracks in cold. Birch bark has been keeping water out of Norse structures for 1,000 years and will continue to do so without your assistance. I have always appreciated the dry confidence of that sentence. He was right. The original bark layer on that Jordstall was still intact when I examined the roof structure in 1914, 29 years after we laid it. Above the bark, 2 feet of packed earth, put on in layers and tamped between each course. Above the earth, sod cut from the meadow below in squares and laid in 2 layers, grass side down on the first course, grass side up on the second, seams packed with loose soil. By the end of October, the grass had knitted and the roof had begun to look like the hillside it was meant to resemble, which was both practical and, in a way I did not expect, quietly satisfying to look at. The south wall was timber framing, a plate and stud construction faced with boards tight enough to stop wind, with 3 windows I had located through a connection at the Mercantile, salvaged from an abandoned homestead east of Maiden. The glass was old and wavy, the kind that bends the light passing through it into something slightly uncertain. But glass does not need to be optically perfect to admit solar energy, and the angle at which I set the frames, 55 degrees from horizontal, confirmed after Astrid spent 2 mornings measuring the shadow length of a marked post and working back to the sun angle from the geometry, was correct for the task. The ventilation was 2 clay-tiled pipes, 4 inches in diameter, running from vents cut high on the south wall up through the roof earth to the surface above. Their placement was not arbitrary. They were positioned so that the warm air collecting at the peak of the interior would naturally move toward them and rise, drawing the lower, staler air upward behind it and pulling fresh air in through the gap at the bottom of the south wall entry, a gap deliberately left 3 inches high, covered with coarse wool batting that filtered the incoming air without blocking it. I did not design this ventilation system. Niels designed it. I made 2 modifications based on the specific geometry of the Montana structure. I increased the pipe diameter by 1 inch over his specification because the animal load Astrid planned, 14 head, was greater than Niels's original 10, and the moisture produced by those additional 4 animals breathing continuously through a Montana winter would require more ventilation capacity than the Dalarna notebook had accounted for. And I added a moisture channel, a shallow groove along the base of the north wall, lined with flat stones and sloping toward the drainage tile, to carry condensation away from the wall base before it could saturate the lowest log course. This was the modification that Astrid noted in her own copy of the plans with the word "viktig," important, underlined twice. She was correct to underline it. Condensation is the silent destroyer of underground structures. Niels had described losing his first secondary structure, a smaller building he had added to his original Jordstall, to wall rot at the base that he had not caught until the damage was irreversible. He had written about it with the honest frustration of a man who knew what he should have done and had not done it, and Astrid had read that section of the notebook several times, I believe, because she could quote it from memory when she explained the drainage channel to me. The earth gives warmth, and the animals give warmth, and the sun gives warmth, and all of this warmth meets the cold air at the wall base and becomes water. Attend to the water or lose the wall. There is no third option. We attended to the water. The structure was sealed in the last week of September. I remember the afternoon clearly, one of those Montana autumn days that seem designed to remind you what the summer was before the accounting starts, clear and still, the light going golden across the ridge, and the smell of cut pine and turned earth hanging in the air around the south wall. We had set the last window that morning. Louis, who was still 3 weeks from his family's departure north, had fitted the door, a heavy plank door hung on iron hinges I had brought from Lewistown, opening inward so that drifted snow against the exterior would not trap the animals. Astrid had carried her thermometer down from the cabin. It was a good instrument. She had ordered it through the mercantile from a catalog, spent 3 months' worth of egg money on it, and handled it with the care appropriate to something that was both expensive and essential. She mounted it herself on the north wall, 6 feet from the floor, in the position that Niels' notebook specified as giving the most representative reading, away from the direct solar gain of the south windows and away from the animal heat concentration near the floor. We all three stood and looked at it. 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the afternoon air was 51. The interior was 7 degrees warmer than the exterior on a mild autumn afternoon, with no animals inside yet and the structure sealed for the first time. Louis said something in Michif that I did not understand. He was looking at the thermometer with an expression that I have since come to think of as the appropriate response to watching a principle prove itself. Not surprise exactly, because he had understood the principle, but something more like the satisfaction of a confirmation that you were right to believe. Astrid said nothing. She wrote the reading in her notebook with the date and the exterior temperature alongside it. Then she went back up to the cabin to begin the evening's reading lesson. The cattle went in on November 1st. The basin's first real cold came a week later, a hard frost that took the temperature to 12 below in 2 nights, which was not unusual for early November, but which had a quality that year that I noticed without being able to name precisely, a flatness to the air, a quality of the light in the late afternoon that was more absolute than I remembered from the previous 2 winters I had spent in Montana. The old Norwegian hands in the basin had a phrase for a sky of that color and that texture, a word I mentioned earlier and will not explain again, except to say that when I heard it used that November, I understood for the first time that it was not merely a descriptive term. It was a warning. I finished my work at the Gunderson place in mid-November and began picking up smaller jobs around the basin, repair work mostly, the kind of maintenance that ranchers put off through the summer and suddenly remember when the cold arrives. I worked for Riley for 3 days, replacing siding boards on the north face of his main barn that had cupped and split over the summer and were letting the wind through in a way that he had convinced himself was acceptable until he stood inside the barn on a November morning and reconsidered. The siding on Riley's barn was 1-inch pine boards, vertical, with 1/2-inch battens over the seams. It was standard construction for the basin, representative of how most of the livestock structures in that valley had been built. I replaced the damaged boards and rebattened the seams, and the barn was, when I finished, as tight as it had been when it was new. I stood inside it when the work was done and felt what the cattle would feel through the winter. The wind that day was out of the north at perhaps 20 miles per hour, which was not a significant wind by Montana standards. Through 1-inch pine boards and half-inch battens, I could feel it. Not as a draft, but as a presence. The cold coming through the wood the way cold always comes through wood that is asked to stand between an animal and a Montana winter, which is to say continuously and without particular concern for the animal's opinion. I thought about the Jordstall. I thought about 2 feet of earth plus the sod above it, plus, eventually, the snow that would settle over the sod and add its own insulation to what was already there. I thought about the differential between what I was standing in and what Astrid's cattle were standing in, and I did arithmetic in my head that I did not share with Riley because it was not my place to, and because Riley had not asked. He would ask eventually, but not yet. December came in with 2 storms in the first week, moderate by the standard of what was coming, but enough to put 3 feet of snow on the level ground and fill the draws to depths that made riding between homesteads a calculation rather than a habit. I made it out to Astrid's place twice in December, checking the structure. The thermometer read 43 degrees on my first visit, 41 on the second, when the exterior temperature was 17 below. The cattle were standing in their stalls, eating, producing the steady, low warmth that animals produce when they are not fighting the cold but simply existing in it, their energy going into condition rather than survival. I checked the ventilation pipes from above, both drawing cleanly, the faint warmth of the interior air visible as a thread of vapor where it met the December cold at the pipe mouth. I checked the south wall for any sign of frost penetration at the base, where the earth outside was freezing to a depth that would eventually reach several feet. There was none. The birch bark and the packed earth above it were doing what Niels had said they would do. I wrote my observations in the small notebook I had started keeping for this project. Date, exterior temperature, interior temperature, structural observations, animal condition. I had not kept site notes before this project with that kind of regularity. I have kept them on every project since. In January, the weather changed. I do not mean that it became colder, though it did. I mean that something in the quality of the cold changed, became less negotiable, less willing to moderate between storms in the way that even hard winters usually allow. The temperature dropped to 30 below in the second week of January, and did not recover above 0 for 11 consecutive days. The sky stayed the color that the Norwegians named. The wind out of the northwest hit the basin in gusts that found every gap in every structure that had a gap to find, and there were very few structures in Judith Basin that did not. I was working in Lewistown that week, thank God, warm enough, watching from the window of the rooming house as the street emptied and the temperature on the Mercantile's exterior thermometer moved in the wrong direction with a steadiness that did not suggest it intended to stop. I thought about Riley's barn and its 1-inch pine boards. I thought about Halverson's place and the cattle he kept in a 3-sided shed open to the south that he had told me in November was perfectly adequate. I thought about the Jordstall on Astrid's Ridge, sealed under its earth and its sod, and the 3 feet of snow that had settled over it since December, and the 14 cattle inside standing in their 43 degrees, and the thermometer on the north wall, and the ventilation pipes breathing their faint threads of vapor into air that was now 30 degrees below 0 and dropping. The great die-up did not announce itself. It did not arrive with ceremony or warning beyond the warnings that the men who paid attention had been reading for months in the grass and the geese and the sky. It arrived the way the worst things arrive, as a continuation of what was already happening, just more so, just longer, just colder, until the difference between a hard winter and a catastrophic one became clear in the specific language of dead animals and ruined men. By the end of January, that language was being spoken across the territory in a volume that no one could ignore. In Judith Basin, it was being spoken everywhere except one south-facing ridge where a woman from Dalarna had buried her barn in the earth and was sleeping, most nights, without particular anxiety about what the morning would bring. The morning was coming, regardless. For most of the basin, it was going to be very bad. The morning of January 7th, 1887, was the kind of morning that ends arguments. Thomas Riley found his north barn wall on the ground before he found his cattle. The wind the previous night had reached a speed that the weather station in Lewistown later recorded at 61 miles per hour. Sustained, not gusting. Sustained, which is the word that separates inconvenience from structural failure. 1-inch pine boards and half-inch battens are not a wall in 61 miles per hour of sustained wind. They are an intention. The wind had noted the intention and declined to honor it. 9 cattle were dead against the south wall of the barn, frozen in the posture of animals that had pressed as far as they could from the cold and found that far was not far enough. The remaining animals were standing among the dead ones with the particular stillness of creatures that have exhausted every available response and arrived at waiting. Their hip bones showed. Their eyes were sunken. 2 of them, the oldest cows, did not survive the week. Riley lost 11 head in 3 days. At the prices of that winter, that was the better part of $800 standing dead in a barn with no north wall. He was not a ruined man. He had more cattle than that, and he had put enough by to absorb the loss without losing the land. But he was a diminished one, and he knew it. And the knowing had the specific quality of a man who understands that what happened to him did not have to happen. That last part is important. Not just that it was bad, that it was preventable. I know what Riley saw that morning because he told me about it himself, twice, years apart, and the telling was the same both times in its essential shape. The wall gone, the cattle dead, the cold inside the barn matching the cold outside it with perfect and devastating equity, and him standing in the wreckage doing arithmetic about what he had known and what he had done with the knowing. He had ridden past Astrid's Ridge a dozen times that winter. He had seen the south wall of the Jordstall with its 3 angled windows. He had seen the ventilation pipes breathing their faint vapor into the frozen air. He had not stopped. Astrid came to him. I want to say that again clearly, because the version of this story that circulated in the basin for years had it the other way. Riley arriving at her door, hat in hand, asking to be taught. That is a tidier story. It is not what happened. She had been watching the lean in his north barn wall since November. She had said nothing. It was not her place to say, and she knew with the accurate knowledge of a person who has been consistently positioned at the margin of a community's decisions that unsolicited advice from her would not have been received as advice. It would have been received as presumption, which is what advice becomes when it travels in the wrong direction across a social distance. But she had been watching. And on the morning of January 8th, the day after the wall came down, she appeared at Riley's place before he had finished his count of the damage. She came with Ole. She had sent word to Lewistown for me 2 days before, when the wind was still building, and she had looked at the lean in that north wall from across the pasture and made her calculation. And she had Neil's notebook under her arm and the plans for Riley's South Ridge already redrawn on brown paper in her own hand. She did not mention what she had seen in November. She did not mention the barn-raising notification that had never reached her place, or the water rights petition, or the cord of firewood delivered without a name. She set the redrawn plans on the fence post and said, "Your South Ridge will work. We can start when the ground is clear enough to dig." Riley looked at the plans. He looked at her. He was a man who had just spent a night watching animals die in a barn he thought was adequate, and the specific education that provides is not available through any other curriculum. He said, "Tell me what it will cost." She told him. He said, "When do we start?" They broke ground on the Riley Jordstall in late April, when the frost had left the soil at the building site to a sufficient depth. The crew was Riley's 2 sons, Halverson, who arrived on the first morning without explanation and without having been asked, and who picked up a shovel and began to dig with the focused application of a man who has decided to be useful and does not intend to discuss it, and a rancher named Cruz from 2 valleys east who had heard about the project and come to see and stayed to work. And me. I designed the improvements that the second build allowed us to make: a larger ventilation pipe diameter, a stone-lined drainage apron along the base of the south wall to protect the foundation from freeze-thaw cycling, an interlocking notch in the wall logs that bound them against lateral pressure more reliably than the peg system we had used on Astrid's structure. These were not large changes. They were the changes that building a thing twice makes available, the corrections that you cannot see until you have seen the first version work and understood exactly why it works, and therefore what it requires. Astrid supervised. She walked the site in the mornings and identified problems before they became problems, which is the most valuable thing a person who has already built something can do for a person who is building it for the first time. She answered questions with the notebook open in her hand when the answer required precision, and from her own knowledge when it did not. The following winter, Riley's cattle went into the George stall in November. They came out in April. Cruz, who had written everything down during the building, constructed one on his own place the following summer using Astrid's plans and his own notes, with modifications for his particular hillside. His cattle survived the winter of 1887 to 1888 in better condition than any of his neighbors. His neighbors asked him about it. He showed them the plans. This is how it spread. Not through ceremony, not through any formal adoption or official recognition. Through the specific and persuasive logic of cattle that were alive in April when they might not have been, observed by ranchers whose own cattle had survived less comfortably and who were willing, on that evidence, to dig. By 1890, there were 11 George stalls in Judith Basin. By 1895, there were 23. A dairy farmer named Bjornstad, who had come from Minnesota with a milk operation, built one with a separate cold chamber for summer dairy storage, using the George stall's steady 44 degrees to keep his butter and cream through July and August. Astrid saw it and said she had not thought of that. She said it the way a person says something that genuinely pleases them, not with false modesty, but with actual delight at the evidence that the knowledge had grown past what she had started with, that it had become something the basin's own, adapted and extended by the people who used it, belonging now to the land and the practice rather than to any single person or notebook. This is what good knowledge does given the room. I am 63 years old, and I have built many things. I have built structures that lasted and structures that did not. I have built things I am proud of and things I would build differently now with what I know that I did not know then. I have learned across 40 years of this work that the life of a building is not determined at the moment of its completion. It is determined in the decade after, when the frost has cycled through the joints and the moisture has found whatever gaps were left for it, and the loads have settled into the members in the way that loads settle, revealing what was right and what was merely plausible. Last autumn I rode out to Astrid's Ridge. Petter is running the operation now, a capable man, careful with his cattle and with his land, very like his mother in the way he looks at a problem before he speaks about it. He uses the original George stall for hay storage, which is not its first purpose but is a reasonable one, and the structure does not seem to object. He has replaced the sod on the roof twice. The drainage tile is on its third section. One of the south windows has been boarded over, but the walls that Louis Deschamps and I fitted against the clay and loam of that hillside in the summer of 1885 are still plumb, still tight, still holding after 35 years of Montana winters without perceptible movement. I pressed my hand to the ground above the structure. Through 2 feet of frozen October earth, I felt it. Warmth, steady, patient. The same warmth that has been there since before any of us arrived in this basin and will be there after all of us are gone. The earth's own temperature, held at depth against all the violence the surface can produce, available to anyone who understands the question well enough to ask it correctly. I stood there for a while with my hand on the ground. Then I went back to Lewistown, to my workshop, and I reached under the bench and took out the small leather notebook that Astrid gave me when she moved to town in 1912. She pressed it into my hands and said I had earned it more than she had by that point, which was not true, but was the kind of generous inaccuracy that I did not argue with. The cover is worn soft. The ink has faded on some pages, and the water stain on the ventilation calculation page has spread slightly since I last looked. It smells of the oilcloth it was wrapped in for an ocean crossing, which is a smell I cannot describe to someone who has not encountered it. Something between linseed and cold salt air and thyme. I opened it to the page near the back where Niels had written, in the margin beside his winter temperature records, the note that Astrid translated for me once in the kitchen of her Lewistown house, the afternoon light coming through the west window, and her voice moving between the Swedish and the English, with the careful patience of a woman transferring something fragile between two containers. I read it now in her English. The earth does not give warmth because it is generous. It gives warmth because warmth is what it has always had. We are only learning, very slowly, to ask. I closed the notebook. Outside my workshop window, the spring was coming into Lewistown the way spring always comes to this part of Montana, cautiously, with frequent reversals, not entirely convinced that winter has finished making its argument. The cottonwoods along the creek were showing the first tentative green at their branch tips. The mud in the street was the particular mud of snowmelt, cold and heavy, the mud that means the frost is leaving the ground. Somewhere in Judith Basin, on a south-facing ridge, 2 feet below the surface of that mud, the temperature was 44 degrees. It had been 44 degrees on the 1st of November, 1885, when Astrid mounted her thermometer on the north wall and wrote the reading in her notebook. It would be 44 degrees next November and the November after that. The earth does not change its mind about warmth. We are only learning, very slowly, to ask. Ola Bergstrom dictated this account to his daughter, Clara Bergstrom, in the spring of 1921. He died in Lewistown, Montana, in August of that year. Niels Erikson's notebook passed to Clara, who kept it until her own death in 1958. It is currently held by the Fergus County Historical Society, Lewistown, Montana, where it may be examined by appointment. The original Jordstall on the Lindqvist homestead was demolished in 1951. The man who demolished it reported that the earthen walls, when finally opened, were warm inside. It was November.